program might contain strong language. If you think you may be offended, switch off now.
Joe and our Inside podcast series. I'm your host, Rob, and with me, as always, is Comrade Ashkan Frishan, a WatchMojo CEO and co-founder. How's it going today, Comrade?
It's going really, really well. Actually, that's not true. I don't want to say no complaints. The last couple days, every time I try to get to some task or another, I got blindsided with Lord knows what. And so it's just, but it's fine because I also get to work on really cool projects. So I'm not complaining. And just very nice to see you as always. So
nice to see you as well. This week is kind of an evolution of what we started last week. Last week we went inside America, and this week we are looking inside capitalism. I was about to say communism. I think it's the comrade in your name, but inside capitalism. And through the lens of America, I suppose, because that's what we talked about mostly last week. So let's start by just going over some definitions. If anybody's joining us that needs some clarity on the terms that we're going to be using, we'll start with let's start with capitalism, since that's the subject of the show. Sure. Let's define that.
Sure. So last week, fair enough, somebody was like, oh, I don't know if you're mentioning fascism. I don't know if fascism is what you think it is. And I agree that oftentimes people conflate not just these terms, but they conflate sometimes, and we'll come back to this, like an economic system like capitalism versus like a form of government like monarchy or a republic, as well as like the degree of social freedoms in a society, whether it's like a democracy or an authoritarian, autocratic kind of society. But we'll come back to that. So capitalism is really an economic, mainly. It's an economic and social and political system by derivative in which a country's trade and industry are ultimately controlled by private owners. And historically, they're chasing profits. Whether or not that's right or not, it is all about, the pursuit of profit.
And okay, so on the other end of the spectrum, we have communism. That's more of a socio-economic,
So communism, it's hard also to be like, well, who invented or who founded it? It's false. It's not like a company. But like by and large, the person that kind of really defined capitalism was Adam Smith in 1776 in his book, The Wealth of Nations. We'll come back to that later. And then, so on the other end of the spectrum, you could argue, at least in terms of economic system, you have communism. Now, communism, and I'm reading the definitions just so that I don't run on. It's more of a socioeconomic order centered around common ownership of the means of production, distribution, exchange, owned by the state. That's the key thing. And it's really the division of that surplus that is created is kind of like divided based on need, which is a somewhat objective but largely subjective criteria. And communism, again, you can't really talk about who invented it. I'm sure this might not have been on your bingo card for books in my library, The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So basically communism was derived out of Marxism, which is a more extreme form, almost like anarchy. And so basically communism was something that was born out of Karl Marx's famous to many, infamous to others, Communist Manifesto. And then from there, you ended up kind of getting socialism. So Engels was more of a socialist, many other socialists as well. Albert Einstein was a socialist. And socialism is a bit different in that the definition is it's an economic and political philosophy encompassing diverse economic and social systems characterized by social ownership. So again, the people, the state own the means of production as opposed to private ownership. And the main difference when socialism is kind of applied into history and countries is ultimately, you have the fundamental industries that are definitely owned. They do permit for like small businesses. Again, we're talking about like countries where socialism has been applied. So it's kind of like the Diet Coke of communism. And communism is the Diet Coke of Marxism. So
right. So milder and milder versions
Well, in effect, because pure like Marxism was not really realistic to apply because it was almost more anarchistic. And communism, we could discuss this later. You could say, was it even applied in what you saw in the USSR and Cuba and other places? But we could come back to that later.
And does socialism have a kind of founder, kind of like
the founder? Again, if you went with a loose founder, would be Engels. Engels, was a bit more dovish in the history. One of my areas of expertise before pursuing business was history, ancient times, and 20th century. So in Imperial Russia, when you had the Soviet Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, there were three main characters whom Orwell captured pretty well in Animal Farm. But you had like Trotsky, Stalin, and Lenin. So Lenin was like the more of those three, Trotsky was the more hardcore one. He was so hardcore to the left that Lenin, who was like the elder statesman between those three, Lenin felt like Trotsky was a bit too intense, and Stalin was a bit more Machiavellian, so he outmaneuvered Trotsky. And then later on in 1940, Stalin's forces killed Trotsky in Mexico City, I believe. But so one of the reasons why the USSR went with Stalin, who then ruled until his death on March 5th, 1953, was because he was seen as like a more moderate in that kind of amongst the three. So yeah, in effect, there's like kind of a degradation of hardcoreness as you slide from Marxism to communist to socialism.
All right. And then we have fascism, which we spent some time talking about last week because the discussion has kind of been, is America moving towards fascism? With censorship and things that have been going on.
So before I define it, it's interesting that when we talked about capitalism versus communism, you viewed them as two ends of a spectrum. And yes, from an economic perspective, that is fair. But from like a political ideology, communism is to the left and fascism is to the right. Now, I would argue that this is not a spectrum. It's actually a sphere where they share some traits in terms of autocratic rule and whatnot. And fascism is defined as a far-right, authoritarian, and ultranationalist. And that's the key. It's the ultranationalism, political ideology, and movement, which rose to prominence in the early 20th century, effectively as a parenthesis after World War I. You saw it with Benito Mussolini in Italy and obviously Adolf Hitler in Germany. And fascism is characterized also by a dictatorial leader who centralizes autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy, parentheses. So when sometimes you hear somebody say, don't be a fascist, they mean that, like, don't think you're better than others. And the subordination of individual interests for the perceived interest of a nation or a race, that's where fascism becomes dangerous, because you could argue, hey, what's so bad about that, being patriotic? It's when you took it to the nth degree and you're like, we're better than these other people. And it's like the whole regimentation of society again. So you could argue fascism and communism extreme, but again, history suggests that they do share far more than they differ in. And so a difference between communism and socialism is communism requires state control over resources. Socialism distribution is based somewhat on contribution and effort. Like at the end of the day, communism is just everybody gets the same thing. You need a loaf of bread, here you go. Socialism makes that bit of a nuance that you still want some equality, you still want state control over like key industries, and frankly, most businesses, like medium to large, but they do recognize to some doctrines and versions of socialism that like, okay, well, you do need to take into account if Bobby works harder than Jimmy. And the difference between communism and fascism is while communism is a system based around a theory of economic equality and advocates for a classless society, fascism is super nationalistic. It's a top-down system and also rigid class roles. And then you have like an all-powerful leader. And again, this is all a lot of semantics and paradoxical, because nobody would say that Stalin, who was a communist leader, was not, an all-powerful dictator, in the same way that today people suggest that Putin, Russia is not really communist anymore. I'm not suggesting that, but it is Russia. It is the continuation of the USSR. The same way that people go, well, Putin is sitting on a $200 billion net worth. Stalin effectively owned everything. So throughout history, Stalin was one of the wealthiest people, which is a bit ironic or hypocritical, depending on whether you're pro-communism or not.
I feel like I've heard a lot of people speak of Canada as being more of a socialist country. Do you think there's any truth to that, or what's your interpretation of that?
I think by virtue of having, like, for all ceteris paribus, all factors being equal, like a health system that is funded by taxpayers, education that is largely subsidized, we do have a safety net. Indeed, Canada, akin to the Scandinavian countries, most certainly has a lot of socialist elements. Would anybody call it a socialist country? Not the way people use socialist, you know. And again, they are conflating economics, politics, and you know, freedoms and all that. But you know, I don't think it's fair to call Canada or Sweden. I mean, I'm not an expert in Sweden, but I don't think it's fair to call Canada socialist, because at the end of the day, you know, there's individuals own businesses. You know, the government doesn't show up at 3 p.m. one day and go, hey, sorry, I really like this WatchMojo channel. It's ours now, but thank you for your service, right? So Canada has socialist even policies, but it's not really a socialist country. And it is a bit of a lack of intellectual honesty if people go, well, socialism has never worked. And they're like, well, what about like Canada? Yeah, well, Canada's a capitalist country. You're referring more to the economic system. It's not a socialist economic system.
Right. And that's one area where people get into trouble when discussing these things, is conflating different elements with either the government system, the economic system. Let's just clarify that.
Yeah, just very quickly. So there's really, I mean, there's more, but I mean, I'd written an article when I was actually looking at Iran, because sometimes in Iran, when people talk about like, is the monarchy better than the republic, they're conflating like whether they're actually discussing democracy versus like a autocratic, you know, society, or like a theocracy versus a secular society. But yeah, so the forms of government are things like monarchy, republic. Economic systems are capitalism or socialism or communism for all intents and purposes when discussing economic systems. The degree of social freedoms, yeah, you could have a, you know, autocratic society, or you could have a like a democratic society where everybody gets a vote and everybody has freedoms and they can do what they want. And then the other consideration, especially with a country like Iran, where I first started to really go deeper down the rabbit hole, is the role of religion. Iran, even though Iranians are not religious per se, there is a hardcore 5-10% who are, and they managed to actually, ironically, pool their energies in 1979 with the Marxists. So it's a bit weird, but the Marxists, and you're seeing it now, you know, the socialists in the streets of America are joining forces with the pro-Palestinian, you know, that religious kind of ideology, so to speak. And so to topple the American empire, so to speak. So it's interesting. But so for all intents and purposes, I think today we'll focus largely on the economic system, but we give ourselves permission to talk a little bit about why some systems are better or worse, because invariably, in fact, so when I read the Communist Manifesto, I actually was like in college and I was young, and, you know, I never had any intentions to go into business. I didn't even like business. But you saw that Marx, who was, you know, kind of a political thinker, his main argument was based around economic determinism, which was like your economic position is going to dictate your worldviews to a large extent. Like if you're well off, you're probably going to be all in favor of the status quo. But if you're like a, you know, working in some industrial plant under horrible conditions and barely, you know, scraping by, that economic reality is what is going to lead to you to be hostile to the system, which, even though Adam Smith defined it in 1776, the tenets of capitalism existed because you did have people chasing profit. So I think that's kind of what we're going to focus on today, which is capitalism good or bad? Is it a good system? Is it the best system? We're talking economic system, but invariably we're going to be including everything else as well. Right.
And I'm looking at the comments and I'm wondering if people understand why we've chosen this topic for today. Why is it relevant to talk about this in the context of what's going on in the world, and particularly America right now?
Well, you know, the irony is like just as recent as, well, first of all, last week when we talked about Inside America, spurned a little bit about Kimmel, which is in the entertainment sphere, but then the week before Charlie Kirk got assassinated. And I mean, clearly your head has to be in the sand not to realize that there are parallels between Germany in the 1930s versus USA in the 2020s. But ultimately, as recent as the late 2010s, you did have this specter of socialism rising in America, where you had a lot of the youth who were disenfranchised. This was a generation that had lived through 9/11, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, where either they suffered injuries. I mean, if they died, they wouldn't be around anymore, or they saw, friends and classmates go to war. Then the Great Recession, and then, fast forward to just inflation and, rising cost of housing, the pandemic, and everything else that we've seen has kind of like exacerbated the haves from the have-nots. And so, yeah, like 6-7 years ago when I produced the documentary Fox and the Hen House, it was a little bit just looking at why are the youth of America, who are in this capitalist system that all these foreigners are still flocking to. It's like the joke was when the Berlin Wall fell, nobody from the West rushed over to the East. It was people from the East who were like going to the West, leaving socialism to go to capitalism, so to speak. So, but it's like, if you think about it now, it's not like socialism in theory is the threat. People are now worried about fascism. So there is like kind of like younger generations, I feel, as they get older, like they do care. Obviously, they care about entertainment and escapism. But as we've seen when we cover these topics, there is a growing interest to make sense of, and Elon Musk, the wealthiest fella in the world, there is this growing interest in, the political and economic system and how it affects them. And it's kind of also normal for WatchMojo. Like when we started 20 years ago, we had a very young fan base. It was a lot of younger viewers who were very early adopters of YouTube. But if you start watching WatchMojo at 15 years ago and you're 30, you care about the new Marvel movie, but you also care about the fact that you can't buy a home, and you got, riots going on in cities after Black Lives Matters. And then you got now people every night marching on the streets, chanting Palestine, free Palestine, or whatever. So it's like, hey, how does this affect me? Which frankly, it affects you a lot more than whether Marvel decides to bring back the Mandalorian or not,
Yeah, definitely. How long ago was it that we released that Fox and the Hen House documentary?
I want to say 2018 or 2019. So
okay,
like
so 6-7 years. And it seems like a lot has changed in America since that time. What kind of changes have you witnessed taking place?
I think the biggest one that I've seen is what I just alluded to, is the demographic, right? I think like it's true. Like it's easy to criticize the youth and younger generations and say they don't know this or that. But historically, the idea was like, go to school, get an education, come out, get a job, get married, buy a house, have kids, work, die. Not necessarily the best future. But that, I mean, you could call it social contract or not, that kind of expectation is no longer realistic. And then now you also have the rise of AI, you have the rise of automation. We've already gone through many cycles of offshoring and reshoring and outsourcing and resourcing or whatever. So the reality is that if you are a young American, you are pissed off legitimately, because everything costs a lot more. Even internally, when we discuss like annual reviews and salaries, I always tell my team, I'm like, guys, I go grocery shopping. I remember bacon, a pack was $3. Now it's like you get half the size of the bacon and you pay 3 times the price, right? And so because we're a small company, I'm like, well, yeah, you don't want to lose your people. But frankly, a lot of corporations, they went through a period in the first 25 years of the 21st century where they overhired because of low interest rates, the zero interest rate phenomenon, period, ZIRP. They just extended. They wanted to grow. They hired. They were like, sure, if you want to do social, you want to discuss social, political things at work, no problem, because we need as many bodies as we need. Oh, there's a pandemic, you want to work from home, no problem, we'll accommodate you. But I think a lot of corporations see that they have probably way too many employees, they need less. AI and automation is going to make that even go lower. So I do think that like the younger generation is facing a tremendous amount of adversity. But also, if you were born in 1900, by your 14th birthday, there was the First World War. When you turned 39, there was the Second World War. in between that, you underwent a Great Depression, right? So every generation goes through crap, but people are generally very, their perspective is just how it affects them. So I think there are, like, I get more and more young people asking me about these things, about like, what does the future look like for me if I can't find a job? Or I thought I had a job, but they just ghosted me. And, there's like an AI system that is supposedly reviewing my resume. I didn't hear back. And there are no easy answers, right? And so, not to be dystopian, but the future is both super bright because of technology. I mean, you hear people say you might live till 150 now. At the beginning of the 20th century, people lived to 30, 35, 40. The number of times you hear, oh, my grandfather passed away at 36 of a stroke, or he died at 40 of God knows what, it's not just Japan anymore. So there is this kind of like disparity, divergence between how long people are going to live and the clarity and certainty around, will I have a job? Will I be able to pay my bills? Can I buy a house? So I just think that everywhere these themes are more top of mind.
Yeah, I think it's the uncertainty is the biggest thing. It's not knowing what the future is going to look like, and it's driven mostly by technology. But within this capitalist system, and US has been kind of like the poster child of capitalism on the global stage for a long time. Let's just go back a little bit and see how it's worked out over the years. What's the history been like to lead us up to the point where we're at?
Well, again, I don't think anybody could be called the founder of capitalism, but Adam Smith and John Maynard Keynes were two, theorists who are credited with the systems that we now live in, right? So Adam Smith in 1776 wrote Wealth of Nations, and he is widely seen as like the first person who kind of codified this system that we call capitalism. And so he talked about this invisible hand. And so he was like a big believer in laissez-faire economics, which basically is a French term for leave it alone. And he felt that the market's invisible hand would auto-magically correct inefficiencies, and basically demand and supply would rectify any unhealthy inequality in society. A simple thing is, if everybody studies to be a computer programmer because they think, ooh, high salaries, all these big tech firms are hiring, but then now it's like AI means you don't need to program, or you need less, for example. Whether that's true or not is not the point. Well, then a lot of younger graduates are just going to automatically shift and go into trades and become electricians and plumbers, because if I have a broken pipe, it might take me a week to get somebody to come see it. But if I want to hire a coder, you could find anybody who codes, right? So over time, demand and supply for different goods, but also services and skills, will raise the salary levels or decrease demand, and ergo decrease salaries. And this invisible hand is going to take care of it. And to be honest, in theory, it makes a ton of sense, because it's really just graphing demand and supply graphs. And, if you move one, what happens to price? It's kind of common sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think where that fails in reality, or is more limiting in practice, is it doesn't really take into account human psychology. And again, I always allude to the sins and virtues, but things like greed, ultimately. So John Maynard Keynes came along a bit later on, and he was like, wait, no. In the long run, we're all dead anyway. So this invisible hand is theory. You do need Keynesian economics. You do need to inject some government intervention in whatever economic policies you have. Now, most systems in the capitalist world, like to your question, is Canada a socialist country? No, it is not. But absolutely, Canada is a lot more Keynesian in that sense, where they're like, well, we don't want to just hand off health to a bunch of for-profit corporations. We still want the government to oversee health or education, right? So Keynesian economics is a lot more representative today than the purest form of capitalism that Adam Smith opined about with the invisible hand. America is a bit more capitalist in the Adam Smith sense. But where there is a bit of a disconnect over the 200 plus years is that, yes, you do see how human behavior left checked leads to bad things, so to speak. That like unions are a great example. If you were like a plant owner in 1903 or in 1903, if the government didn't tell you that like you can't hire a 5-year-old, even if they're small and they can go up a chimney to clean it, what Dickens wrote about kind of stuff, they're like, that's not kosher. We don't want a 5-year-old doing this. So they're like, okay, the working age is 12 or 14 or 18 eventually, or 21. Same thing with drugs, right? You can't just be like, we're Pfizer, we got this amazing drug, it's going to cure you. Oops, we made a mistake. It's not 0.1% who might get polio. 15% get polio. Well, the government's like, yeah, that's way too high of a error rate. We need a higher confidence interval, right? So the government steps in and goes. So I think what you've seen is in America is, and then it does oscillate quite a bit, but you have seen this softening of laissez-faire capitalism, where especially historically when Democrats were in power, you had a little bit more of, I don't want to use socialist practices, but less pure capitalism. And then when the Republicans come in, they're generally like, we believe in a smaller government. As Ronald Reagan said, the worst words you want to hear is, hello, I'm from the government. I'm here to solve your problems. You're like, no, you have no idea. And I struggle with this because sometimes, like in Montreal, Quebec, our province, state of Quebec in Canada, I'll go to our DMV sometimes and, to renew a license. And once in a while, usually with certain services, I'm like, these guys are so efficient. They actually have, like, it's amazing. You walk in, maybe an hour, like there is some wait or whatever, but everything's there. They do it 3 days later, a week later. And you're like, for the number of people that they have to process, they do a good job. Other times, you might have a free health system. You go there, you twist your ankle, and because it's not your heart or your brain, so it's not a priority. They're like, just sit here. 18 hours later, your ankle is swollen and you can't see a doctor. Now you could pay to go see a doctor as well, faster in theory. But so what you see is capitalism has basically been watered. I mean, the way Adam Smith saw it has been watered down because of human behavior. And then on the other end, you can make the argument that communism ultimately failed because there aren't really any countries that implemented, let alone survived and thrived under that system either.
Let's go to a question. I see. So Connor Sorensen writes, why is a media company pretending to be educated enough to speak on systems of economics? I understand you may have seen top 10 Marvel movies or top 10 Star Wars characters and are wondering why we're doing this now.
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. So, let's actually go more general. What a lot of people like this gentleman, it was Connor?
Yes.
Okay, so what this gentleman says is they don't actually know because their head is too, it's tunnel vision. WatchMojo actually is a company that started covering history. If you go back to our first videos, you might have seen some fashion, some travel, some cooking, but like a lot of our content was the rise of Hitler. Like I myself have written books on Alexander the Great, and we were also doing the history of entertainment. And yeah, over time, we've been around for 20 years. We covered the history of entertainment. So we could have done like the biography of Elvis Presley, or we could have done top 10 Elvis Presley songs. But because we balanced things that we're interested in with what audiences like, then we married the two. And what really became popular, admittedly, was our era when we focused on pop culture and geek culture. But it was because the best media companies are ultimately like the best investors, social scientists that see what's happening. So in the 2010s, yes, when a company like Disney bought Marvel, Lucas, and Pixar, it was pretty clear that that whole fandom universe and geek culture was going to blow up. And myself being younger at the time in my 20s, it made a lot more sense for us to cover that. Now, if you think of what ended in the 2010s, it was the end of peak TV and the streaming wars. And the same way that Marvel overdid it, media is undergoing a cycle led by, again, technology, streaming, the internet, also socio-demographic changes, globalization, yada, yada. And so what people, like we cover the zeitgeist, what people are interested in, that has shifted. We could produce a top 10 Disney characters we would like to see on the silver screen. And we don't focus on views, but we don't ignore them. We're not stupid. We do want to serve our fans. And when we do parallels between Germany and in the 1930s and America in the 2020s, that'll get 300,000-400,000 views. If we do is the American Empire going to be done by 2026, not for shock value, but just because America is going to turn 250 next year, and that is the average age of empires, that video will get 400,000 or 500,000 views, right? So I understand if Connor is, and I love it. I love that Connor is in a place in his life where he still only cares about Marvel and only cares about Taylor Swift or Slipknot or whatever. But the world is changing, right? And as our audience also evolves, we really are, we're still doing a ton of entertainment content, but we are branching out into areas, frankly, that especially I personally was always really into. But I didn't necessarily kind of like propose it to the team as vehemently. But I think once we started doing them, the team saw that, yeah, there is an interest amongst not just our viewers, but, viewers at large, and we're serving them, right? But again, it's like we publish 20 videos a day across Watch Mojo, Miss Mojo Plays or whatever. You can click. This is not North Korea. I am not a supreme leader. You can click on what you like. You can click on one video, or you can click on 10 videos. And we live in a democracy. You see how things connect, Connor? You are free to do what you do. You can watch it. Yeah.
Feel free to not watch any more of our podcasts if you wish.
No, and so that's actually what you meant. And so for us, a little parentheses is when we said we would like to cover things a bit more topical, but still in a kind of timeless packaging, and we said podcasts, especially video podcasts, would make sense. I did tell the team, I said, our videos, our entertainment videos are so good. You guys do such a great job. I said, I'm not sure if the podcasts are they're going to be different. Some will like it, but I said, I don't know if that really is going to be that additive. If somebody's going to listen to a couple of guys talk about the new Marvel slate versus watching top 10 movies we're excited about Marvel in the next, I think you're just kind of like eating away at yourself. But I was like, why don't we use the podcast to branch into new areas? And after doing 20 on like history of YouTube and Watch Mojo, where we kind of know that history well, obviously, we were like, it would be cool to just pick a topic that's kind of in the news that, again, we know about. I've written books on these things. I've been, but also I don't overthink that anymore, because the internet is great for this. There's like 7 billion people, and many billion have phones, and many billion are on the internet, and you can make everybody happy.
That's right. And if you have any suggestions for themes that we should cover in future episodes, please don't be shy to comment and leave those suggestions for us. There's another interesting comment here from Julio. In communism, the goal is to keep everyone equally poor and the rich keep on getting richer. Marx and Mao were oppressors. And this kind of makes me think about, so we spoke about Marxism as the precursor to communism and socialism. Was there anything about it that worked on paper or made sense, but just didn't in practice?
So I remember listening and then asking. I remember speaking to somebody that used to live in the USSR who left and moved to North America. And this was at a time when I was a bit more socialist in thought. Still like a capitalist, like I like to think ethical capitalist. I don't think laissez-faire capitalism works. And I asked him, I said, I kind of challenged him. And I said, well, what about this or that? He goes, look, at the end of the day in USSR, the government pretended to pay us, and we pretended to work. So nothing ever got done. But meanwhile, Joseph Stalin had a fortune while he sent millions and millions of people to gulags and killed them. So when I talk about capitalism, and I said human nature makes it so that laissez-faire capitalism cannot work, communism is the same thing. Fidel Castro probably stashed away billions and I went on my honeymoon to Cuba. I was young, and I was, as I am, always asking questions, talking to locals. And as much as a lot of people have a hard-on for the Fidels of the world, or, there's people that put up pictures of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei of Iran, as he supposedly stands up. Ali Khamenei, he has a net worth, apparently, according to Reuters, of $125 billion, while Iranians cannot get electricity, water, or food, meat. Right. So I'm not picking on Fidel or Khamenei. I'm just saying human nature left unchecked leads to greed taking over and all that. I would love to know where Julio is from, not to presume or project that he can't be born in America. He very well was probably, but I mean his parents and grandparents, because this is another interesting thing. Those who have lived in socialist countries understand what it's like to live in these countries where the state and a handful of politicians control all the wealth, enrich themselves when the average citizen has nothing. But if you're a purple-haired, kid in college that has no real education or experience living in these countries, but you're bitter and you're worried about the future, what do you pick on? Do you pick on yourself and criticize yourself for studying dinosaur gender studies? Or do you blame the system, the government, the big corporations? It's a lazy worldview, but it's a worldview that many people have because understandably their future may not seem bright to them, right? But I also, and I didn't appreciate this, I was born in Iran. So Iran, you can't say it was socialist, but the Marxists were the ones that were going to take over in 1979. They joined forces with the clerical, the mullahs, the religious, the 5%, not even that are. But then the Marxists, being idiots at the end, got outsmarted by the clerics who just killed them. They basically said, you guys are, bad people. God says so we're going to kill you. So, for example, when a lot of Iranians in the diaspora see what is happening now with like colleges and by the way, I am quite left of center ideologically, but it's got to make sense. Like socialism doesn't work if Stalin gets all the money and everybody else is poor either. Like you're a sheep for thinking that worked, But so when Iranians who experience 1979 and the revolution see what happened there, they're the ones now that are ringing the alarm bell in America or France or UK or Canada who say, this combination again of the Marxists, the leftists, the socialists, with the militantly religious who are not at all open-minded, who are not at all respecting other people's freedoms, this is a dangerous combination which could topple a secular democratic society that happens to be capitalistic. But at that point, the economy's in the background. It's the freedom level of society and whatnot. So again, I don't know about Julio, but anybody that has parents or grandparents that has lived in a socialist country doesn't like it. The only people that seem to be members of the fan club of socialism are, frankly, like the kids of wealthy people who kind of, have these worldviews that are a bit disconnected from their upbringing, but they're virtue signaling, or people who understandably face a very, very uncertain future. But instead of taking personal responsibility and saying, maybe I need to educate myself, maybe I need to gain experiences, maybe I need to shut up and listen and learn instead of just pontificating about worldviews, and that's another school of thought, like individualism and all that. But, we could stay focused on socialism, communism, and capitalism.
Right. And so we already established that historically, communism doesn't seem to work. Is there any situation in which socialism could potentially work? Maybe in just an.
So let's go back and then we'll get to current. Again, the Karl Marx fanboys, the only argument that they could have is that when Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, he didn't envision that to happen in a pre-industrial country like Imperial Russia. Right? And the reason why the Tsar fell was because the quality of living was low. Again, the elites controlled everything. But a lot of the farmers, a lot of like the normal citizens of Russia were living in not the best of conditions. So Marx's idea was if you apply a system like communism or socialism for all intents and purposes to an industrial country like Germany that from 1850 to 1900 had in many ways overtaken the British Empire. And then if it wasn't for World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and then Hitler's maniacal obsession with the final solution, Germany would have been like America. Germany had all the doctors, all the engineers, all the inventors. But if that is the only argument, if the Marxist crowd had like good debating skills, they would say, well, we never even tested communism. USSR was not what Marx envisioned, because you had to apply this blueprint, well, more of a roadmap, to an industrial country like Germany or America. But by applying it to a premature child, then communism never had a shot, right? Now, other places like Venezuela, shit show. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves. Now, again, you can discuss the quality of the oil, the cost. Okay, that's not this podcast. We could do inside oil much later.
Talk about Jerry Jones and the Cowboys.
Yeah, but the point I'm getting at is, you could make the argument that like if this would have happened in Germany, it would have been different. But Venezuela has the largest oil reserves, but it's a shit show. Again, corruption, right? Argentina, in 1900, Europeans left for New York City or Buenos Aires. Yes, many of them also came to Montreal, but so Montreal and New York had a parallel kind of, they could have both been bigger, but New York was clearly going to win. But Buenos Aires was like strong and had all the natural resources. It could have been a powerful force. And again, I was in Buenos Aires. I'm not making this up. I speak to people, and when I find an opening, I converse and I educate myself aside from what the CNNs write and what even experts say. Mm-hmm. But the problem was just bad management. And so that is the problem, is in as much as that invisible hand theory is nonsense, socialism also does not work, because you do need individuals. I write about entrepreneurs, right? I write about leadership. You don't want greed. You don't want people that are always thinking of themselves, and those make bad leaders usually. But you do need a system where somebody takes a risk, and that's I'm not even talking about startups and money, but you do need to take a risk. Think of soccer clubs or football clubs. They all started by people who were workers. They would play football, and then they were like, let's build an association where we could pool resources. And that's why sometimes in some cities, you got like a ton of shareholders for some of these clubs, right? But my point is, ultimately, there has never been a real example of a socialist economic system working. Name me, Cuba. I was on my honeymoon. People quote like, oh, this people get sugar for free, and oh, you get like free healthcare. Yeah, but everything else sucks. You could blame the embargo, and I think that is fair. You could say, well, the American embargo means they don't get this. Yeah, okay, fine, but that's not the root cause of it. At its heart, it's just a bad system that assumes that people act in fair, altruistic ways. And human natures don't. Human beings are very selfish. I don't want to name names, but I'll just say in my career, maybe at WatchMojo or before, we'll leave it vague, I've had some people on my team, whether I was the CEO or not, who claimed to be very socialist in thought. But then when I would kind of like hear their feedback, I would prove to be more socialist minded, meaning I was like, well, this makes sense for you, but how do you think this affects everybody around you on your team? It doesn't really seem fair to them. And they never had an answer. So socialism, in my humble opinion, was no different. It was just, throughout history, you've had individuals that look for a purpose in life, whether they were vain or sincere in their purpose and principles, who kind of reflected the macro environment. I alluded to the prophets. The prophets were people when before you really had science, before you had any institutions, who were just like, we're a bunch of people, nomads living together. And we need to make sure that we don't fight, and we need to make sure that we coexist. So sure, whether God spoke to them or they had this kind of like worldview, they kind of created the set of laws that people interact with. Then you had kings who had to kind of bring a bunch of people together. And then later on, you had, inventors, and you had, we've talked about entrepreneurs, how they fit. But I also think that a lot of these folks, the Stalins and the Mussolinis and the Hitlers, the Churchills and the Roosevelts, through the Western lens, we view some as good or bad. And I'm not here suggesting Hitler was anything other than horrible, or Stalin was a nice guy who was misunderstood. They were clearly bad people, but to people around the world, the Roosevelts and the Churchills were bad people as well, right? Mm-hmm. So the point I'm getting at is individuals always look at the macro, And it's not a coincidence that Mussolini and Hitler saw Italy and Germany destroyed after World War One, and they kind of came up with these fascist systems. And then Stalin saw an opportunity with, the situation of Russia and the rise of America. But it's always an individual who ultimately is seeking something personally that then kind of builds a more social movement. It just so happens that in the beginning of the 20th century, these movements were political.
Right. I think the fundamental question that we wanted to get at with this podcast was, is capitalism a good system, or is it just the best that we have? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I don't think anybody would ever say that capitalism is perfect. And I mean, I myself from the beginning, Adam Smith, I respect him as a thinker. I mean, anybody that kind of in 1776 would write such a book, I mean, I respect that, but I don't agree with that version of capitalism. Keynesian sometimes is taken too much to the social, where you think the government needs to be your babysitter. So I'm not saying I'm Keynesian either. But yeah, I think you nailed it. I think capitalism is the best system that exists, because not just of the economic part of it, capitalism is also the only system that then creates and engenders, not perfect, you have to work at it, you need the right leaders, and you could make the argument that politics attracts the worst people. I didn't go into politics. I was like,
I don't think that's a controversial statement. To be
no, because I do think politicians are vain, and politicians also have donors, and politicians have to play a certain game. And that wasn't for me. I wasn't going to go kiss people's ass and ask for their support and then have them like control me. Like, I would have wanted to pursue what was right and what was fair. And naively, I did think business was the better path. That's also why I referred to this, why WatchMojo doesn't have 50,000 employees. Because I don't think integrity scales. I think it's really hard to keep quality and integrity when you have 500 people and a whole level of mid-management that's doing Me Too shit. You know what I mean? Like, that's just, let's be candid. So I do think capitalism is the best system, but not only, I just want to be very clear, not because of only the economic part, but because that is what leads the best society. That is also what leads to the right amount of like freedoms for people. And so undoubtedly, like, I don't want to say prove me wrong, but if not capitalism, socialism hasn't worked. Communism definitely didn't work. But I've always, like, the way that now, like, servant leadership, like when I started, I do think like what we need to do is encourage younger leaders to understand what ethical capitalism is. And whether you call it ethical capitalism, progressive capitalism, conscious capitalism, it is all semantics, but some kind of balance where you put people at a profit, you are long-term greedy, but you kind of like look at a stakeholder approach to, okay, like for WatchMojo, look at the gentleman before Julio, Connor. We didn't tell Connor to go F off. We didn't say he's wrong. We didn't throw shade. It's a valid point, right? So that's a community. You respect your community, you respect your viewers, employees, your team, the government, yada, yada. We're in Quebec, right? So I'll end on this. The government comes sometimes and they go, we want you to do all your employment agreements in French and English, or give the option. I get it. If you're a Quebecois living in Montreal, even if you understand WatchMojo is an English place of work because it's an English media, just if anybody's listening. But if you're like, well, I want to make sure that my HR review is French, yeah, I get that. I don't have any problem with that. It's just respect and common sense. And the problem is most people lack that. We all have our faults. I have my faults as well. But I think when it comes to economic systems, capitalism is the best canvas, undoubtedly.
Well, I'll leave us with a comment from Chapter Black, who's left a bunch of comments, so thank you for that. Even Churchill said that capitalism is the worst economic system except for all the others.
Yeah, so. Exactly. Yeah, that's I had read that. I love that he mentioned it. He or she or they. I think that is really well put, and I don't always agree with Churchill, but he nailed it on that one.
All right. Well, this was a great conversation, Ash. Can't wait to see what we're going to talk about next time. But this was quite informative, so I hope everybody enjoyed it. Leave your comments down below what you want to hear us dissect in the next episode, and we'll see you guys all next time.